Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Very generous introduction by Bilal, as always. Thank you for inviting me to speak here briefly about the work that I do with Charity Right. So Charity Right is a food specialist charity. We specialize in providing food to some of the most needy people around the world. And primarily, obviously, it's focused on poverty. There's a saying attributed to Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he says that if poverty was a human being, I would have slain him. If poverty was a human being, I would have slain him. Because when it comes to poverty, when people are afflicted with poverty, your iman is at risk. And sometimes people end up taking actions that they would have never contemplated on doing. People resort to criminal activity they would have never contemplated of doing. And it is a disgrace, the fact that so much wealth there is in the Muslim world, yet there is poverty in the Muslim world. I want to give you two case studies. So I work in various parts of Africa. In the recent East African crisis, East African famine crisis, there was a story of there was a brother who had made a journey from a very far away village, and he was told that there was food available in Mogadishu. Upon hearing that, he was contemplating whether to, pack his bags with his two children and his wife to travel tens of miles, if not hundreds of miles, across the desert to get some food. It got to a position where they haven't eaten in days, if not weeks, and his wife said, "Look, I am near death, but you have two children that you can possibly, keep alive. So why don't you pack your bags and just start walking towards Mogadishu, and hopefully, inshallah, by the grace of Allah, there will be some food available where you can survive this difficult circumstances." So he leaves his family home, knowing the fact that he will never see his wife again, most likely to have passed away. Halfway down the desert, he comes to a situation where he has to make a decision. Remember, this brother hasn't eaten in days. His children haven't eaten in days. All three of them are very weak to walk, very weak to carry each other. And at that point, he has to make a decision whether all three of them stay where they are and die together, or where he has enough energy to take one of his children and leaves one child behind. And he realized that he has a responsibility of keeping at least one child alive. So he makes a decision of leaving one child behind, knowing the fact that this child will have no one will reach out to this child to keep this child alive, knowing the fact this child will die. And he made that journey to Mogadishu for food. And we almost always talk about poverty as something happens in the developing world, in countries that we've come from originally. But right at our doorstep, there is poverty as well. Many years ago, there was a sister who set up a soup kitchen. And in this soup kitchen, many Muslims and non-Muslims used to come for food. And a lot of these homeless individuals knew on each day of the week where to get food from. So her soup kitchen was stationed outside a central London venue, and took place every Sunday. And there was a sister who used to come there. At that point in time, I used to work for a charity that focused on poverty in the UK, and made a referral to me, telling me that there's a sister who's been abandoned by the family and has been living on the street. So I reached out to the sister, and she said that she would only communicate to me through Facebook, because she had lost trust in the Muslim community, especially men. So when I did speak to her, I went to her Facebook page and realized she came from the Shia background and had various kind of sayings of the imams on our page. And yet there was no one in our community to reach out to the sister and say, "You know what, I'll give you a roof over your head. I'll give you food tonight." Because this sister, who's probably most likely, if not dead, is still on the streets, was facing predicaments where she was making decisions because she hasn't eaten in days whether to sell herself or not. whether to allow a man to rape her or not, so that she can get shelter. And this is the stark reality of the world that we live in. Tonight, this very night, as we have our food later on, 800 million people around the world will go to bed on an empty stomach. 800 million people. Yet there's 1.4 billion tons of food that's wasted. 1.4 billion tons. That would feed a third of the world. A third of the world. And I'm going to quote Pope Francis, who, in a statement in 2015, it's a document that each pope has to kind of compile called the Laudato Si. And in this document, he highlighted one of the crises that's faced the world is two things. One is climate change, and the other is sustainable development. So he highlights climate change and sustainable development. And everyone knows how many charities we have in the UK, raising funds year on year, yet there is lack of collaboration between these charities. Everyone's in their silos trying to raise funds for different groups of communities because for whatever political reasons, for whatever religious reasons or sectarian reason, they don't want to collaborate. Now, if we look at the crisis in Yemen, a population of less than 30 million people, about 14 million people are facing starvation. 85,000 children have already died, and 2 million children who are severely malnourished. It means there is no turning back on the health of these children. There is no turning back. Even if you have to give them food, plentiful supply of food, the damage that you've caused to these individuals is irreversible. They will forever be in an unhealthy state. Now, if you were to look at the population of Muslims in Europe, excluding Turkey, there's about 44 million Muslims. Now, according to my experience, and if you look at zakat alone, an average donation of zakat per year is around £250. Now, out of the 44 million Muslims, if 4 million Muslims were to give £250 per year, that's £1 billion of zakat. £1 billion. Now, we always boast about, Muslims are the most charitable group, and we donate £100 million in the space of 1 month in Ramadan. That equates to something like £38 per second. These are figures that haven't reached the potential that it should reach. And these aren't figures considering taking into account the khums and sadaqah and other forms of donations that Muslims make. There's 10,000 British Muslims who are millionaires. If you to collate their funds together, that's £4 billion. That's £100 million of zakat there alone. And I'm not talking about, again, khums and sadaqah. It's just £100 million of zakat alone. So the reality is that we are failing to kind of connect the dots. We are failing to connect the dots between the different sections of the communities and different charities. Like every single year you will hear names of charities. And you know what? Muslims are so ingenious in making names of charities that doesn't reflect another charity. And I don't want to mention names, but just change a little word and then they will set up a new charity and then all of a sudden they're raising millions of pounds. Millions of pounds. But the reality, if you think about it, every single charity will have a CEO. And every charity will have the equivalent of me, like a head of programs. Every charity will have a finance person. Every charity will have a auditor and marketing person. That means the costs are multiplied many times over. So can you imagine the amount of waste, the amount of donations that are going to waste because we can't work together. There's probably thousands of head of programs like myself trying to deliver essential needs to Muslims all over the world. But in reality, there's over $1 trillion on a yearly basis of zakat flow. $1 trillion. Then why is it the fact that mostly Muslim nations are in poverty? Yet there's $1 trillion, and that's at the lower scale. It's actually estimated between 2 to 3 trillion. Now, in 2015, the whole world came to the United Nations and decided that they will work towards the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in the 17, to achieve those goals, it requires something between 3 to 4.5 trillion US dollars. But it's estimated by 2020, Muslims will be given in zakat alone, 2 to 3 trillion US dollars. That's at the lower end of the scale. So if Muslims were to just collaborate, we will be able to achieve the 17 sustainable goals within the space of the next years. But the state that we're in, it is unachievable. We will see our sisters who are forced to sell themselves so they can get a meal. We will witness brothers and sisters having to make a choice. We have to leave a child behind in the middle of a desert, knowing the fact the child will die. We will see horrendous crimes committed in the name of securing some sort of wealth. If you go to the camps in Bangladesh, where the Rohingyas were fleeing the violence from Myanmar, Bangladeshis were saying, as the Rohingya were crossing over these bridges, these bamboo sticks, where people are crossing over with, on one hand, all the belongings, and on another hand, another child. And another Bangladeshi man or woman say, give me the child, and I hold the child for you whilst you cross over. As that happens, that person will run away with the child, putting that child into some sort of sex slavery or some sort of servitude at someone's house. I'm Bangladeshi, so I can kind of dig into the state of affairs in Bangladesh. In Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingya camps are, Bangladeshis are exploiting the vulnerability of Rohingya women, knowing the fact that they need food for themselves, they need food for their families, they need food for their elderly. They will exploit them by, first of all, taking them away, gang raping them, and then put them into prostitution. If you interview these women, they'll say, all I want is the fact that I want my life to return, where I can pray 5 times a day, where I have the security of a home and a shelter, where I don't have to sell myself. And I have to sell myself because my dignity is not as important when it comes to feeding my own children. How many brothers and sisters here have children? What would you do to give some sort of food to these children? I think a big lesson for us is that we need to kind of collaborate. We need to come together, and this petty sectarianism, this petty kind of politics needs to put aside. Because if we don't get our act together today, with the rise of the far right all across Europe and all across America, our time will be next. Did you know that the rise of far right has come about this refugee crisis? This small refugee crisis from places like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan have come into Europe. But in the space of 3 weeks, there were more refugees that had flooded into Bangladesh than the whole of Europe. But if climate change, as the Pope Francis kind of identified, if it's not addressed, then the people's need for food will make them move from one country to another country, and now from one continent to another continent. So the flood of people from Africa coming into Europe is only going to increase. And as a result, the far right will come into power. They can't even tolerate the very small number of Muslims that have come over. And the far right is a serious threat. Every single day you hear about a brother or a sister who's been attacked. Brothers can easily get away with it, but the sisters can't because they're so easily identifiable. You don't want the threat to come to your doorstep. So we need to get our act together. Jazakallah khair for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.